You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio. Welcome to the Bitter Medicine Podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. Our show focuses on Black news and entertainment, arts, science, economics, history, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans within the diaspora. And now, your host, whose favorite color is black, Goku.
Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I am Goku. I'm your host tonight, as always. Before I get into this reading tonight, I want to remind you guys that this show is part of a podcast network called KWAZ Radio. There are other shows that you are invited to tune into.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-Black perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
Greetings, fam. Tune in to The Learning Curve with me, the revolutionary matron on KWAZ Radio.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Yes, indeed. Make sure to check out all of the shows on KWAZ Radio. Make sure to like their videos, their content. Make sure to subscribe to their YouTube channel. Click the bell to be notified when they have new content up. And also subscribe to the KWAZ Radio YouTube channel as well. Like I always say, we have some stuff coming up on there, so you want to subscribe there as well. I don't know if you guys checked it out, but the revolutionary matron on her show, The Learning Curve, has been putting in work. Let's get her to 100 subscriptions ASAP. She's been putting a lot of work, a lot of watch hours. I mean, she's been doing 5-hour shows, including the Solution Summit that myself and Onita Say joined her on that episode. That's like a 5-hour episode with other guests as well. It was a great time. Then later that day on Saturday, she did her regular 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time show. And then she did an After Dark show with Agyei that night as well. So, you know, she followed that up on Sunday with a show, then another After Hours show as well that had Kevin Carre on it, Agyei Commander, and D Webb from the Harsh Reality Podcast. Also, check out the Harsh Reality Podcast. They just dropped a new episode as well as the Pro-Black Perspective on Sunday. So there's a lot of content coming out of KWAZ Radio, and we're still trying to expand our reach. We're trying to have podcasters from the continent. You know which continent? The African continent. We're trying to have podcasters who are on the ground, in the continent, on the ground, in the Caribbean, on the ground, in the UK, on the ground, throughout, you know, Central and South America too. You know, so if you have an interest, you have a voice, you're on the ground in these different locations, you have something to say, you have the zeal within you to want people to know what's going on in your neck of the woods, what Black news is going on in your neck of the woods, you should consider joining KWAZ Radio as well. In addition, if you have a small YouTube channel that you would like to grow, let's say you're talking about African spirituality, for example, that's something that we're looking for here on KWAZ Radio. And you're hearing this, join KWAZ Radio, and here's how.
Have you ever considered joining KWAZ Radio? Each of our hosts shares their unique perspective with you. You might have a perspective that needs to be shared. If that's true, hit us up at kwaz.radio@gmail.com. What are you gonna do? What you gonna do?
What are you going to do? So again, if you have a voice, you're in one of these locations that's necessary for us to know what's going on there, what's the way of life, what's the way of African life there, etc. Join KWAZ Radio. Email them at kwaz.radio@gmail.com. Let them know where you are, who you are, what you do, etc. And let's get it going. All right. Now we got the business out of the way. We're continuing the reading of Nation Building on Tuesdays for the next few weeks. I'm going to continue where I left off. I left off on page 51 last time. Nascent nationalist Pan-Africanism. Let's get right into it. And again, I'm going to read for about an hour and a half, probably an hour and a half or so. And then we'll continue next time. And as always, I'll be here Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturday, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. On Tuesdays, for the foreseeable future, we'll be reading this book, Nation Building. On Thursdays, I'll be back with a paper of my choosing. And on Saturdays, we'll chill, sit back, and we'll do a Shoot the Breeze episode, which is becoming pretty popular amongst those people who listen to KWAZ Radio. Nascent nationalist Pan-Africanism, the currents of race consciousness, resistance, and aspirations of liberty that motivated enslaved Africans also infected their free brethren. Among those free Africans in the northern states and scattered through the antebellum South, the currents of a nascent nationalist Pan-Africanism found expression toward the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th centuries in the mutual aid societies, the independent church movement, social and fraternal organizations, and the National Negro Convention movement. The fires of African nationalism were stoked by the words of Dessalines, quote unquote, the Avenger. This quote is independence or death. Let these sacred words serve to rally us. Let them be signals of battle and of our reunion. And his cry of death to the whites, which reverberated throughout America and Europe. It's during this period that we find David Walker's appeal, Henry Highland Garnett's call for a Negro nationality, and Nat Turner's strike for liberty. This period saw the beginning of independent African educational institutions, both among free Africans and among the enslaved, that strongly repudiated the theories of racial inferiority and promoted self-reliance. Self-reliance or self-sufficiency is an ideological current, was to persist throughout the remainder of the 19th and into the 20th century. So this brings us to a section called Integration, Accommodation, and Assimilation. The activities of liberal whites, including the Quakers, and the activities of the prominent white abolitionists provided a stimulus for the growth of the integrationist ideology and sentiment. Prominent among the integrationists was Mary Ann Chad, who professed that racial parity could only be achieved through integration. The integration of this period, however, was undergirded by a strong appeal to self-sufficiency. The advent of the Civil War and the emancipations of Africans ignited hopes of integrationists and accommodationists that America's white supremacist legacy would be abandoned. Those hopes were quickly dashed by the intransigence of the South and the hidden agenda of Northern Republicans. The freed African was abandoned to the terrorism of the South by the Hayes Compromise, quote, the counter-revolution of 1876, end of quote, but not before leaving their imprint on the movement for universal education in the South. The first great mass movement for public education at the expense of the state in the South came from Negroes. Public education for all at the public expense was in the South, a Negro idea. Though some prominent African leaders advocated integration or assimilation, the masses of Africans were driven by the urge for freedom and self-sufficiency. Frequently, the impetus for the educational movement during the Reconstruction era is attributed to quote-unquote Yankee benevolence or federal largesse. But it was observed by most that the ex-slaves' educational movement was rooted deeply within their own communal values. The sense of race pride and independence left many missionaries astonished and chagrined to discover that many ex-slaves had established their own educational collectives and associations, staffed schools entirely with black teachers, and were unwilling to allow the educational movement to be controlled by the civilized Yankees. What are you doing today is what I will add, right? The enthusiasm and tremendous energy of Africans displayed in building independent educational institutions and promoting self-reliance and justice for all was betrayed by the opportunism and insincerity of Northern politicians. The priority of the Northern whites was speedy political reconciliation with their Southern brethren, and economic advancement, justice, empowerment, and reparations for Africans be damned. The post-Reconstruction years saw the virtual re-enslavement of Africans, widespread brutality, and rampant racism in both the North and the South. These were the years of the white citizens' councils and the Ku Klux Klan. These were the years of white racist terrorization of the African community. Rampant lynching and burning. Schools and educated Africans were high-priority targets of this era. Educationally, Africans continued to advance self-reliance and independence in their educational institutions. The educational philosophy that was designed to accommodate the African to the servile position that white America deemed appropriate was developed by Samuel Chapman Armstrong of Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute. Armstrong's ideology of accommodationism was adverse to the ideology of self-reliance, dignity, and freedom of the independent African educators. The ex-slaves struggled to develop a social and educational ideology singularly appropriate to their defense of emancipation, one that challenged the social power of the planter regime. Armstrong developed a pedagogy and an ideology designed to avoid such confrontations and to maintain within the South a social consensus that did not challenge traditional inequalities of wealth and power. Armstrong's ideology and pedagogy centered on preparing teachers who in turn would prepare Africans for a subordinate social role in the South, and who would manifest no desire for political power, or in any way challenge the Southern planter class or the emerging Southern industrialist and Northern investor. Armstrong's ideology attracted substantial amounts of money from Northern businessmen and philanthropists. Armstrong's prized pupil was Booker T. Washington, and the efforts of Washington at Tuskegee are often linked with Armstrong's at Hampton. Washington expressed great admiration for Hampton, and he ostensibly modeled Tuskegee's industrial education program after Hampton's. Washington did in fact receive substantial amounts of money from sources initially associated with Armstrong at Hampton. To his credit, Washington did believe that the Reconstruction era federal government was mistaken in failing to provide the freed Africans with land and general education. You see, you know what it is. When it comes to land and education, why would they give you that? They didn't bring you here for land and education. Washington's advocacy of suffrage for Africans further distinguished him from Armstrong. Washington's efforts at Tuskegee also emphasized self-reliance to an extent that exceeded the efforts at Hampton under Armstrong. Right? So we see that somewhat ideological connection. To this day, you'll hear students from Hampton show you know, from Hampton and from Tuskegee show a kind of a kinship, right? Pan-Africanism. This section is called Pan-Africanism. It goes like this. The close of the 19th century saw a resurgence of racial pride and race consciousness. Prominent among those who advocated Africa for the Africans was Bishop McNeill Turner. This era saw the emergence of Pan-Africanism and a resurgent African nationalism. Du Bois' advocacy of political self-sufficiency gained prominence after the death of Booker T. Washington. After the UNIA Convention of 1920, Marcus Garvey and the Universal Negro Improvement Association exemplified the popular nationalist sentiment of Africans worldwide. Its programs and political initiatives in economic and political self-sufficiency grew directly out of the traditions of race pride, self-reliance, and resistance evident in the earliest ideological traditions of Africans in this hemisphere. So that's the thing that you would notice too, right? And again, in Garvey's time, you had folks who didn't want to be considered African, right? But one major difference you'll see between those times and now times is when folks said race pride or race first is what we would is how we would say it today, right? Their race was African, right? And so they believed in these traditions of African pride, African self-reliance, African resistance, etc. Whereas today, unfortunately, most black folks you hear talking about B1 and black first and all that kind of stuff is their tribe first, is black American first, is black self-reliance, black American self-reliance, black American resistance, right? There was a time when we but we did understand, for the most part, we were Africans. Again, there was some, and we know who the some are by their lineage today, there was some who didn't want to be called African. And so this is how you get like terms like Negro and stuff being used like that. Garvey was particularly inspired by Washington's ideology of self-sufficiency and incorporated that theme in the educational program established under the UNIA. Though the Garvey movement declined in the late 1920s, there was a resurgence of race pride and consciousness in the late 30s, when the Italian invasion of Ethiopia confirmed Garvey's prediction. This period also saw the emergence of nationalist movements on the African continent, culminating in the 1945 Pan-Africanist Congress in Manchester, England. The founding of the NAACP in 1909 served to invigorate the integrationist or assimilationist ideology among Africans in America. The NAACP's commitment to end the disenfranchisement of the African population and to assure fundamental civil rights was ultimately compromised by its policy of non-economic liberalism, whereby blacks had to forswear any program for economic advancement as a matter of civil rights principle. You know, that's what you gave up during the civil rights movement. Why do you think that was the terms? Think about that. Why do you think those were the terms? NAACP and the Movement for Integration had one of its greatest triumphs in the 1954 Brown decision by the Supreme Court. It is clear now, however, that that decision did little to improve the relative educational and economic position of Africans in this society. The current of self-sufficiency and race consciousness was largely abandoned by the advocates of the integrationist ideology. The thrust toward integration eventually led to a diminution of black control of the educational process of our children, the loss of innumerable teaching, administrative, and support positions, and the loss of the cultural and social centers of countless African communities. It exacerbated what had been inconsequential class differences within the African community as the well-educated abandoned the African communities in pursuit of their assimilationist fantasies in white professional or social circles and suburbia. Additionally, many of the historically black universities were threatened by the integrationist legacy of non-economic liberalism and the white liberalistic thinking that has permeated the ideology of civil rights leaders since the founding of the NAACP. Of course, the NAACP is a white institution claiming to be in service to black people, right? To continue, the 60s saw a groundswell of nationalist consciousness, fed in part by the independent struggles of African countries, the nationalist or Pan-Africanist teachings of Kwame Nkrumah, Patrice Lumumba, and Malcolm X. The renewed interest of the African community was in part a reaction to the increasingly transparent racist resistance of the white political and economic leadership to substantive socio-political and economic gains by Africans in this country. Though that black consciousness movement was compromised by its lack of ideological coherency, and the FBI's massive and sustained program to destroy the movement, the underlying nationalist, self-reliant ideological current endured as it has always. The contemporary African Centered Education movement hails the advent of the ideological current of a comprehensive nationalist Pan-Africanism, firmly grounded historically and more coherent theoretically. Though the integrationist or assimilationist sentiment is still prominent amongst Africans, the integrationist ideology has receded somewhat, its appeal compromised by recalcitrant and endemic racism unveiled by America's economic stagnation. This brings us to a section called Independence or Infusion, Priorities in African Education. Independence or Infusion, Priorities in African Education. There are two currents in the contemporary African-centered education movement. That current, which has sustained the historic focus of self-reliance and self-sufficiency, race consciousness, and commitment to nationhood, has concerned itself with developing independent institutions, supported wholly by the African community. This current can be identified as the independent current within the movement and is a component of the comprehensive nationalist Pan-Africanist ideology described above. A parallel current in the African-centered education movement, best termed infusion, can be characterized as a radicalized integrationist thrust. It is motivated by the same economic and psychic dependency that Booker T. Washington, Du Bois, and Malcolm X criticized. Its ideological aims are unclear, and it pays lip service to the need to consolidate and expand independent institutional base of the African nationality. This thrust has a serious liability in that its most vocal advocates are themselves frequently dependent upon white-controlled institutions for their sustenance and intellectual validation, and have achieved their prominence largely as a result of a reactionary and hysteria-oriented white media. Those infusionist advocates, though well-meaning, have served as beacons for racist and opportunistic white academicians and politicians who, together with their white brethren in the media and their political and economic connections, will attempt to misrepresent and discredit the movement to the African population. Right, so you see here how these things work hand in hand, right? You see how education plays such a central role in so many avenues and opportunities for indoctrination, right? These white boys, through their media, right, thwart right? And confuse, right? And that's why we have to counter that with our own education and our own media for our folks to consume and to be positively indoctrinated by. You know? That's what it is. Right? These white reactionaries and their colored accomplices in the press and academia are typically motivated by the potential profit and the attention that white hopes, quote unquote, white hopes, usually command when acting in the capacity of sentinels for the cause of white culture. They will attempt to set in motion the same corrosive dynamic that resulted in the weakening of the Black consciousness movement in the 70s. There are a number of anti-African code words and phrases that have become the favorite tools of Eurocentric propagandists. The conceptual or propaganda tools of choice to date include multiculturalism, the charm of Americanism, right? These are all quotes. Splendid diversity, separatist impulse, balkanization, a pluralistic society, which we see a lot of that term pluralistic society when we do these readings on African Centered Education, right? Each of them is a propaganda ruse intended to camouflage the centripetal and hegemonic position of white supremacist European culture, because many of the issues of this particular current in African-centered education are defined in the language, institutions, and value references of mainstream white supremacist ideology. The agenda and direction of the infusionist current tends to be reactionary. Infusion advocates find themselves in endless rhetorical volleys with the self-proclaimed defenders of European culture, where each party makes endless claims and counterclaims, most of which are usually insubstantial and irrelevant. I see this all the time. By engaging in fruitless debate and being maneuvered into reactionary postures, the infusionists inadvertently allow Eurocentrists to determine the content, direction, and priorities of their efforts, and perhaps more tragically, the debate itself provides standing and credence to the same Eurocentrists, white and colored, who have already been discredited in their failure to effectively educate our children. Now, we see this a lot on social media, where we see Black folks every day trying to engage white folks and I guess trying to school them, quote unquote, and that's just nonsense. That energy that you're putting into that nonsense, you could have been putting that energy into educating an African child, into re-educating an African adult, right? Preferably a parent to one of those African children that you're trying to educate, right? And by the way, that's something that I noticed too, that when I, for example, talk about an African-centered curriculum, make no mistake that although the curriculum are for our younger Africans, our youth, that curriculum is also for their parents. Those things go hand in hand. The days of giving your children over to someone else because you're too lazy to do it or too occupied otherwise, we're trying to end that stuff. Even if it's a supplementary homeschool education, something to do on Saturdays or Sundays, right? It's for the adults to learn too. This is not just for you set them down somewhere and you tell them, well, have at it. No, this is for you to be the example in the home and to be the teacher in the home as well, right? Doing this work yourself and coming to this understanding. So, because what will happen if you did it that way is now the way you go about your life when it comes to your children just changes. Your conversations change. I could tell you right now, my conversations with my kids are different than the average conversation. Not to say that it's better than anyone else's conversation or worse than, but it's different. When I start to bring up certain things and start to engage my kids on white nationalism / white supremacy, what have you, my kids already are thinking about this conversation in that light. So this education, even though the stress is on kids, it's also on the adults. That's implied. So I want folks to understand that, right? But to go back to this point here, wasting your time trying to one up a white boy is kind of a waste of time. And if you're not careful, what you end up doing, right, this is what happens to a lot of black folks. You end up going up against these white folks who have concretized their lies, their propaganda, their deception so well now that you end up pulling a Tariq Nasheed where you look silly. I said it at the time, I'll say it again, but Tariq Nasheed was owned for the most part in that discussion. He just looked dumb. It's a waste of time. There's nothing to it. It's better you go and do something, something tangible with the African youth. To continue, the concern is correctly expressed that concerted efforts must be made to infuse African-centered content into the public school curriculum where the overwhelming majority of our children are being educated. The concern is valid, but in a situation where less than 10% of the teachers in the entire U.S. public school system are African, and fewer are administrators, and where 99% of those are adverse to anything African-centered, the infusion battle must logistically be deprioritized to the more urgent and demanding need for independent institutions to supplement and correct the distortions of the public schools and to replace them where possible. The obvious need of the infusionists to appeal to white educators and politicians means that their efforts will be characterized chiefly by appeals to the libertarian intellectual traditions and sense of fair play of those same educators and politicians. It's just stupid. Whether the tactics are confrontational or accommodational, the object of those appeals will be to gain the approval, permission, sanction of those non-African authorities to impart some part of our heritage to our children. Chancellor Williams has addressed this particular posture with the observation that historically, equal rights and equal justice will never come from appeals to the mighty and granted as an act of grace, but only from a united people engaged in great and vast undertakings of their own. I mean, this should be obvious, really. What routinely occurs with efforts to infuse African-centered content is a now standard sequence of obstacles, beginning with administrative obfuscation, followed and augmented by multicultural fiats, right, delusional and divisive stratagems, then the exertion of power politics and financial power to maintain Eurocentric hegemony. The mainstream politicians and school administrators justify their obstinate defense of Eurocentric hegemony because, though flawed, it's the best we have. Or more accurately, lump it because you people don't have the political will or power or the economic muscle to do anything. Speaking of that, let me just segue here for a second. Let me put y'all up on something that is happening here in Brooklyn that my boy Gunnar the Sauces put me on to just the other day. And we had to kind of laugh. It's because it's so ridiculous. In Brooklyn, if you're familiar with Brooklyn, Bedford Avenue and Church, at that intersection, there's a couple things at each corner. On one corner, there's a gas station. On the other corner, there was like an open lot. Across from the gas station, there was like an open lot. If I'm not mistaken, it's in that open lot that was there was an African burial ground there. And if I understand what Gunnar was telling me, I think they had built something on the African burial ground already, right? And they're about to build some housing or something on that space. Don't quote me on this, right? I think that's what, if I remember, that's what Gunnar was telling me. But here's the thing. With all these black folks in politics in Brooklyn, again, if you know Brooklyn, you know what I'm talking about, right? The guy who's the public advocate, no, the people's advocate, I went to college with that guy. So did Gunnar DeSources, so did Kevin Carr. We know this guy from college, right? I heard nothing from his camp concerning it, right? There's all these other different folks around here. And side note, a lot of them are first, second generation Caribbean folks too, right? And apparently they had a town hall meeting for folks to come and air out their grievances and whatnot. The problem with that is that by the time they have those town hall meetings, those T's have been crossed and those I's have been dotted. They've signed that contract already. They sold that shit already, right? They're just letting you come out there and talk a bunch of bullshit while they quietly to themselves, just kind of laugh at it, right? They just kind of laugh at it. And yeah, so like there's a gas station on one side, there's burial grounds on the other side. For a long time it was an open lot. I haven't been past it in a while, right? But if I'm not mistaken, I think Erasmus or someone has something built there already, right? And I think they're now looking to build some like housing there. If you don't know, Brooklyn is full of new apartment buildings going up. They're squeezing those shit in everywhere, right? But the point is, not one Africana Studies department said anything at the colleges around, and the popular one of the colleges, Medgar Evers, right? Not one of these black officials in politics said anything, right? And the real kicker is they allowed these folks who attended the town meeting, who wanted to protest, they allowed them to protest something like close to 10 blocks away from where the actual site is. And there was some BS excuse that, they weren't granted a permit in that area. Mind you, there's a gas station across the street from this place. You could have gone there or wherever, on the sidewalk, block off the streets. You don't need a permit to protest. Especially when all these so-called black political leaders in Brooklyn are getting arrested, right, for show, right, for some BLM bullshit, right? They're on camera getting arrested for show. None of these guys were out there, right? They made them go about 10 blocks away to have a little protest, not even in the area where people could see where it is and understand, or like, oh wow, this was an African burial site. And you know why it is? Those black folks who are in politics who didn't show up, haven't said a peep about it, for this reason right here. Because you people don't have the political will or power, nor the economic muscle to do anything about it. And the real kicker, that place where they were protesting 10 blocks away from what Gunnar told me, when you go there, they playing Peter Tosh. They got a Rasta man selling coconut water. And all the dumb, symbolic bullshit that you could expect. This is where our people are. And low-key, as Gunnar pointed out to me, and it's true, the fact that a lot of these political folks in Brooklyn are first and second generation Caribbean folks, that looks really bad. I'm saying it here today. Saying it where folks can hear it being said. That looks and feels really bad, because it seems like, the way it looks like, because it's African American folks in that burial ground, you didn't give a shit about that. We gotta change that type of bullshit. African is African, right? If that was a Grenadian burial ground there, I'm sure the people's advocate or the public advocate, whatever his title is, right? I'm sure he would have been out there, because his people is from Grenada. You understand what I'm saying? That's real bad business, right? And I just want to put it out there that we don't agree with that bullshit. Right? All these local colleges around the area. In fact, the Medgar Evers is on Bedford Avenue, just further up. Not a peep from these folks. I am here, and I didn't know about it. I live in the Little Caribbean area of Brooklyn. I did not know about it. Right? That's bad business. And it's because you people don't have the political will or power nor the economic muscle to do a goddamn thing about it. That town hall was a sham. That protest was a sham. They've already cut that deal. That shit is gonna go through. And our African American ancestors who were buried there, their graves will be desecrated. You can, and as a Jewish group doing that too, and I'm saying the word too, you cannot desecrate no Jewish burial site. You couldn't do that, talking about putting up some housing or some bullshit like that. Couldn't do it. And that's shame on us for not even realizing it was there. Right? I think they discovered it like 20 years ago. Right? Not even realizing it was there. Not even knowing that there's these deals being made to build over it. I get why Whitey would do it. Right? Savage as they are. I get why they would do it. But we were supposed to have more balls and more backbone than what we've displayed in this instance. I want to thank Gunnar DeSauces for putting me on to that. You know, to continue with the paper, I digress. But I just had to put that out there. This saga of obfuscation, dilution, slothful incrementalism, underfunding, and termination is being played out in city after city. In Washington, D.C., for example, a strong grassroots drive for an Afrocentric curriculum has been effectively frustrated by a disinterested bureaucracy, political and financial power plays by white and allied politicians, and a hostile white press. See, this is why I tell you, the press, this media thing that you see us doing at KWAZ Radio, understand what it's for. You know? A new superintendent committed to multiculturalism in a 98% African school population, along with the blessing of a well-oiled and healed white minority political machine, have essentially checked the Afrocentrist dynamic. Meanwhile, the independent African Centered schools are experiencing record enrollment figures and are swamped with applications even in the present climate of economic depression. African centeredness, as it relates to the philosophy, character, and content of education, has been aggressively pursued by the independent Pan-Africanist schools for 25 years. The immediate historical precedent for the current movement are to be found in the work and teachings of Marcus Garvey and the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the efforts of the Nation of Islam, and the teachings of Malcolm X, the earlier efforts of Prince Hall, Richard Allen, Madame DeVoe, the Sabbath schools, the Freedom schools, and the countless and unknown efforts to establish independent schools are important as evidence of the historic and continuing passion for education and self-improvement that Africans have maintained throughout our sojourn in this country. The contemporary movement can trace its beginnings to three distinct sources: Malcolm X's Black nationalism, and later the cultural nationalist theory of Maulana Karenga, outgrowths of the freedom school efforts of the civil rights movements, and the efforts of the Council of Independent Black Institutions, also known as CIBI. We've read about CIBI a lot on this show in the past, right? The efforts of independent Black institutions, IBIs, have been focused in the inner city at the grassroots level. The ongoing efforts of the IBIs have been crucial to the maintenance and development of the Afrikan Centered Education movement, as those institutions and the individuals connected with them have served as incubators for the current popular acceptance of African centeredness during a period when materialism, self-interest, and individualist self-gain reigned supreme. The Pan-Africanist school movement saw its greatest numbers and popular acceptance during the early 70s, when the Black consciousness movement of the 60s was still influential within the African American community. By the mid to late 70s, the Black awareness movement had been seriously compromised by the disinformation, destabilization campaign of the FBI and the cultural distortion of the media, the aging and abandonment of the movement by many of the professional and educational elite. Additionally, the movement was weakened from within by opportunism, ideological conflict, paranoia, ineffectual leadership, lack of managerial skills, and a weak financial base. The numbers and size of Pan-Africanist school startups diminished correspondingly, and many fail. I just want to touch on some point they made here in the second to last sentence. Additionally, the movement was weakened from within by opportunism, ideological conflict, paranoia, ineffectual leadership, lack of managerial skills, and a weak financial base. The thing I want to focus on in that is opportunism and ideological conflict. If you listened or if you were in attendance for the Solution Summit that we did on Saturday on the Learning Curve podcast with the Revolutionary Matron, there was a bit of a back and forth discussion late in the episode where I forget the brother's name again. I think it's Rock Soldier. Versus Medjai Commander, who's frequently on the Learning Curve podcast with the Revolutionary Matron. Rock Soldier was kind of against the idea of holding folks accountable. His personal outlook was he allowed people to do whatever they want to do, right? If you want to be a Hebrew Israelite over there, go ahead and do that. That's not, according to him, that's not his people per se, but you guys go and do that. But the issue with that stuff, right? The issue with that and why you need to hold folks accountable, and the best way to hold folks accountable is really to start folks off with a race consciousness, right? So if you're doing stuff outside of the race, against the race, etc., right, you are out of bounds or off code, like some folks used to like to say, right? And so you should expect, if you don't self-correct, you should expect some consequences for that, right? And only had a good input on that too, because the brother Rock Soldier was saying, like, if you hadn't discussed the terms and had an agreement on these things, how can you hold someone accountable, et cetera, and only put in that, well, if you come through an organization, right, you would have had the discussion, etc. I'm saying, though, if you start off with a race consciousness first, like those Jews have a race consciousness, right? They see themselves as a race, and they have a consciousness towards that. In fact, I recently saw, I forgot who it was now, but someone here in the States, I think it was, who's Jewish, said straight up and down, like, yo, our allegiances is to the state or the nation of Israel above all else. And this is some dude who's some ranking official, like in America, right? If you guys know who that was, if you guys are familiar with what I'm talking about, post it in the chat. right? We have to have that same thing. You can't be Jewish and doing anti-Jewish stuff or Islamic and doing anti-Islamic stuff like there was an author back in the day who, I'm not mistaken, he comes from an Islamic family, but he's not practicing Islam. Salman Rushdie. And he wrote something about the Ayatollah, if I remember correctly. And they had a death hit out on him for years. I think they finally lifted it like 10 years ago, but for a long time, he had to kind of stay in the shadows. Other people don't play that game, right? And so these ideological conflicts and the opportunism that's being talked about here, that's one of the things that we have to get in check. Yes, we need to be, right? We need to be on the same, and if not the same, we need to be on very similar pages. We don't need to be doing the work that we're doing, and here comes some Eldridge Cleaver fanatics out here, doing some deviant behavior, right? Or some Karenga fanatics on some deviant behavior, right? We don't need that. We need solid, race-first organization that's aimed at the re-education, re-Africanization of our people, that's aimed at acquiring the skills and know-how to build and maintain a powerful African nation. We don't need all this fragmenting, to be honest. We don't need all this fragmentation in this movement. And so these ideological conflicts have been and will continue to be an impedance to us unless we start taking on the mindset of, if your organization gets to it and makes some shit happen, then these other organizations need to just take the knee and be subsumed by the organization that's really getting it done. Because that's what I personally see, and I've seen this since my college days when I used to actually be out there around organizations. Back when I was a college campus organizer as well, right? Gunnar DeSouza and those guys know what I'm talking about. Kevin Carre and them are familiar, right? We would partner up with these different organizations, and I would wonder, why are y'all doing this? As opposed to working with them over there. And in fact, what you ended up seeing was some of the same faces in all these different organizations. I don't have all that kind of time to be in 6-7 different organizations. That if you created a Venn diagram of these organizations, there's heavy intersect between them. We need to consolidate these ideologies. We need to consolidate our aims, our goals, our focus, and just build with like people to continue. The decade of the 80s constituted a period of retreat and dormancy. A number of the surviving institutions altered their cultural orientation to attract professional or otherwise full-paying clientele. The study of African languages such as Kiswahili, requirements of traditional dress, intense cultural references throughout the curriculum, the themes of self-sufficiency and Pan-African unity were abandoned or moderated to appease the culturally moderated and neutered buppies. Well, I haven't heard that word in a while. Right, who often frowned on the intense ideological and cultural focus. The interests of that clientele, who most often found it necessary or desirable to interact with whites professionally and socially, were best served by a curriculum that sought to blunt the personal and collective memory of the barbaric cruelty of the Holocaust of African enslavement and soften the anger or psychic dissonance that attends the memory that memory of the direct linkage to the contemporary crisis afflicting our communities and the African world. Although it is unfortunate that several of the founding members of CIBI failed, including Shul Ya Watoto in Chicago and Uhuru Sasa in New York, and that many others were reconfigured, including Wusei Shul in Brooklyn. The role of the IBI remains the same. That role is to serve as the center of a cultural community wherein an African American cultural continuum, fully conscious of its Africanness, is explored, reconstructed, perpetuated, and transmitted. The IBI, in Imari Obadeli's words, must serve as a liberated zone where African culture, spirituality, and economic self-reliance is nurtured by a supportive community and is shielded by the communal energies of that community from the assimilative thrust of white supremacists and its Negro apologists. The African Centered Education movement must be understood as a part of a historical continuum, a part of that 3 millennia struggle to reconstitute African civilization, to vindicate those innumerable souls lost and being lost in the most heinous crime in human history, the Holocaust of African enslavement. African Centered Education is one battlefront in the ongoing war to recover and reconstitute African civilization and dignity. This is a battle for the mind and souls of our people, and like any sustained battle, the advantages and ultimate victory lies with the morally righteous, the best prepared, and the most determined. We must engage this battle with the intensity of a Dessalines, the perseverance of a Mandela, I don't know about that, the conviction of a Garvey, the thoroughness of Joe, and the vision and sense of destiny of an Aha Menes. Nationalist Pan-Africanism and African-centered education is a part of a historical continuum that is global in dimension. It is significant that the two African populations whose struggles most parallel each other, Azanians, South Africa, and Africans in America, are both presented with the opportunity to construct a philosophy and system of education that is a true reflection of the African cosmology, and which actively and unapologetically advances the interests of the African world. The Azanians have reached this juncture through the undying support of the people for independence and liberty. The Africans in America are presented with the opportunity once again because of the tremendous groundswell among the people for an educational and cultural experience that reflects their unique Africanity and offers the opportunity for their children to advance the status of the nation or race toward national identity, dignity, and sovereignty. The educational interests of these two nationalities must supersede interests in mere literacy. For the leadership, practitioners, and theorists in these nationalities and other African nations to limit their efforts and visions to literate and computational competencies would be to betray the soul of the African world. The vast literacy campaigns of Ghana, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, among others, can never lead to true national or cultural sovereignty because their ideological foundations fail to address the need to reconstruct the African cultural identity. After centuries of European efforts at dismemberment and inferiorization. Too much of the educational efforts of nominally independent African nationalities assume that the philosophy, design, and content of European education is superior to one fashioned from the revitalized African cultural dynamic. This war to liberate the African mind entails abandonment of the familiar chains of dependency. It requires the reconstruction of the African cultural personality. When the shootings and shouting stops in Azania, And in America, the war will still be far from concluded. It will end only when we can definitively say that we have recaptured the minds of our people. Chancellor Williams tells us that this is task number one. It will not be easy and will not be easily achieved in a single generation. We will be able to claim ultimate victory when our progeny carry with them the memory of the present generation's success in building the institutional foundations to the final stages of reconstructing an African civilization on par with the accomplishments of our most celebrated ancestors of antiquity. Right? So that ends that section. Right? These are the references. So this brings us to the section or chapter of the book called Interactions. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to take a quick station ID, and we'll be back on the other side. We'll read a little further, and should we read further? You know what? I'm going to end it here. When we pick up again, because this has been an hour, when we pick up again, we're going to pick up on interactions. But first, let me do a station ID break before we leave.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
Greetings, fam. Tune in to The Learning Curve with me, the revolutionary matron on KWAZ Radio.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Yes, indeed. Make sure to check out all of that good content that came out of KWAZ Radio this past weekend. Make sure you guys check it all out. Drop comments under those episodes to let the hosts know that you guys appreciate them, that you're listening. Let them know that what they're doing is not in vain. I'll be back on Thursday with a paper to read, and again on Saturday. Both days at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'll be back on Saturday to do a Saturday night Shoot the Breeze. You guys make sure to leave your Shoot the Breeze topics on the Discord. The link is pinned at the top of the chat. The link is also down in the description of this episode. Join the Discord today. Find your way. If you don't know how to find your way, post a message in the general channel asking how can you post to the Shoot the Breeze section. You have certain topics you'd like to hear, discuss, and participate in the discussion of on Saturday Shoot the Breeze. Try and hit those up a little earlier in the week so that if there's something I'm not familiar with, I could research it and look it up, right? But you guys make sure to check out all the shows on KWAZ Radio. If you know someone who would be a good fit, a good addition to KWAZ Radio, let us know at kwaz.radio@gmail.com. I'm going to end it here. I think this is a good place to end it. Next time when we come, we'll read interactions. I might spend a longer time that night for interactions. We'll read that night. Drop a 1 in the comment section. Drop a 1 in the comment section or in the chat if you appreciated this reading tonight. Right? There's some fundamental stuff in here, but it's good to go over because this book is going to get to its crescendo, this idea of the African Centered Education, and you want to have those fundamentals down first, right? So make sure, drop a 1 if you're appreciating the readings. I will see you guys live on Thursday. You guys be good. Peace.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Koku. If If you like what you just heard, we hope you pass along our web address, bitamedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Beta Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Beta Medicine Show, Twitter, Beta Meds, Tumblr, Beta Meds, Instagram, Beta Medicine.